On a night when the rain poured down over Seattle, Clara Bennett had just wiped the last pane of glass to close out a grueling 16-hour shift when she caught sight of a small figure beyond the curtain of rain, a teenage girl in a wheelchair, trapped beside the rushing water at the curb, trembling violently from the cold. Without a moment's hesitation, she rushed out into the storm and brought the girl inside. She wrapped her in a warm blanket, made her a cup of hot milk, and for the first time in a long while, made a complete stranger feel sheltered. But what she did not know was that across the street, inside a sleek black car, a man was quietly watching her every move, his eyes cold as steel, his hands the very ones that, only hours earlier, had made the city's entire underworld hold its breath. He was the girl's older brother, and the one man no one in Seattle dared to name aloud. Clara's kindness on that rainy night would pull her straight into a world she had never dared to imagine. A world ruled by power and ruthlessness, where a man who thought he had buried his own heart was about to learn how to love again. Could a single cup of hot milk thaw a heart that had been frozen for years? The story has only just begun. If this story touches your heart, leave a like and share it with someone who could use a little warmth today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so every day can begin with a story that moves the soul. Inside the laundromat, the yellow light spilled down onto the tile floor, where streaks of rainwater had followed the footsteps of the two of them inside. Clara Bennett locked the door to keep the wind from blowing in, then turned toward the little girl sitting curled up in the old wheelchair. The girl's pale blonde hair clung together in wet strands, water dripping steadily onto the shoulders of her shirt. Clara took another clean cotton towel from the basket of laundry she hadn't had time to fold, then gently blotted each strand of the girl's hair dry, her hands moving slowly, as though she were afraid that even one careless movement might frighten her. The girl sat still, her thin shoulders still trembling, but her eyes kept following every motion Clara made, cautious and guarded, the kind of look worn by someone who had grown used to being arranged by others instead of being asked what she needed. Clara recognized it at once, and she didn't rush. She pulled a plastic chair closer, sat down a little lower than the girl so she wouldn't have to look up, then smiled with great tenderness. "Are you feeling a little less cold now?" she asked, her voice soft, as if she were soothing a baby bird that had just fallen from its nest. The girl gave a faint nod, though her lips were still pale. Clara stood and walked to the corner of the shop, where the small stove she used to warm food during long night shifts was set up. She took out a carton of milk, poured some into a little pot, and turned on the flame. The scent of warming milk slowly spread through the room, mingling with the steam in the air, easing some of the damp cold that still clung to their skin. While she waited for the milk to heat, Clara reached for the thin blanket she always kept on the shelf in case the weather turned cold, wrapped it around the girl's shoulders, and carefully tucked it near her neck. The girl shrank into the blanket, and for the first time, her shoulders trembled a little less. Clara poured the milk into a ceramic mug, tested the heat against the back of her hand, and only then handed it to her. "Careful now, it's still a little hot," she reminded her. The girl accepted the mug with both hands, pressed her icy palms against its warm sides, and took a small sip. Her eyes drifted closed for a brief moment, as though that warmth had reached someplace deeper than the chill on her skin. Clara sat down again, rested her chin in her hand, and let the silence pass for a while before speaking. "I'm Clara," she said. "People around here usually call me the owner of the laundromat that stays open the latest in the neighborhood." "And what's your name?" The girl hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the mug, then answered in a faint voice. "My name is Sophie." Clara nodded, repeating the name as if she wanted to remember it. Sophie. That's a beautiful name. She didn't press her with questions. She didn't demand to know why a teenage girl in a wheelchair had been out on the street in the middle of rain like this, even though 100 questions were crowding through her own heart. She only asked small things. "Do you often pass through this neighborhood? Do you like warm milk better, or hot chocolate? Were you very cold out there in all that rain?" Each question was like a step Clara set down very gently, so Sophie could climb down on her own without feeling afraid. Little by little, the girl's shoulders loosened slightly, and the guarded look in her eyes softened. In a broken, uneven voice, she told Clara that she had been taken to an afternoon drawing class, and afterward she had wanted to manage a short distance on her own so she could get used to it. But then the rain had suddenly started pouring down. One wheel had gotten stuck in the gutter, and her phone had run out of battery without her realizing it. Clara listened without blaming anyone, only nodding with sympathy. "So you happened to run into the sky on one of its moody days," she said. "Good thing you were right in front of my shop." As they spoke, Clara noticed that Sophie was still clutching something tightly against her chest, wrapped inside her wet coat. It was a hard-covered sketchbook with worn edges, the corners of the cover curling from the damp. She held it close to her heart as though it were more precious than warmth itself, even while her other hand still shook from the cold. Clara didn't ask what was inside. She only said gently, "Let me get another towel and wipe some of the water off your sketchbook. All right? Before it gets ruined." Sophie looked up at her, surprise flickering through her eyes, as though she wasn't used to anyone caring about something she treasured. She gave a small nod, then loosened her arms just enough for Clara to blot the cover dry. In that moment, something very fragile seemed to kindle between two strangers inside the little shop, while outside, the rain still lashed in waves against the glass, and across the street, a pair of eyes continued to watch every gesture they made through the sheet of water. A few hours before the rain had time to pour down over Seattle, on the top floor of an abandoned building in the old harbor district, there was a room almost swallowed by darkness, with only a faint wash of light spilling in from the distant street lamps beyond the glass windows. Lucian Marchetti sat in the leather chair placed at the center of the room, one leg crossed over the other, both hands resting loosely on the arms of the chair, motionless as a statue carved from the coldest stone. In front of him, a large man was being held on both sides by two of Lucian's men, sweat beading across his forehead even though the room was cold, his eyes darting again and again in search of an escape that didn't exist. Lucian said nothing for a long while, and it was that silence itself that made the other man tremble more than anything. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even, without a ripple of emotion, each word falling slowly like drops of water turned to ice. He told the man that he knew everything, from the money he had secretly funneled to the opposing side, to the list of names he had planned to sell in exchange for a little safety of his own. The man stammered out explanations, reaching for every excuse he could find, saying he had been forced, saying he had no other choice. Lucian only tilted his head slightly, and that small tilt was enough to make the man fall silent. In his world, he said, there were certain mistakes a man was allowed to make, and there were others he wasn't. Betraying trust was the kind of mistake that left no road back. He rose, walked closer to the window, and looked down at the black river rippling beneath the lights. His back turned toward the man, and that calm posture only made the air in the room grow heavier. He went on, saying that he wasn't a man who enjoyed striking first, that he didn't take pleasure in making others suffer, but there was one boundary he had set from the very first day he stepped onto this path, and he had never crossed it once. He never touched the innocent, never laid a hand on the weak, on women, on children, on those who had no way to defend themselves. The only people who had reason to fear him were those who had grown used to using their strength to crush others, those who bullied people who couldn't fight back. And the man before him, Lucian turned and looked straight into the eyes of the man kneeling on the floor, had chosen to stand with people like that. Lucian signaled to his men, not to injure him, but only to take him out of the city and cut off every path he had left in their world, a punishment heavier than any wound on the skin, because for men like them, losing all power and having the entire underworld turn its back was more terrifying than anything else. When the door closed behind the man, the room returned to stillness, leaving only Lucian standing there in the dark. A loyal man who had followed him for many years stepped forward and quietly reminded him that lately, ugly rumors had been spreading, that someone was probing to see whether the coldest boss in Seattle had any weakness. Lucian didn't turn around. He only answered in a voice so light it seemed weightless, yet sharp as a blade, saying that in his world, revealing a weakness was no different from signing his own death sentence, because his enemies wouldn't aim at him. They would aim at whatever he treasured. That was why, he said, he had spent many years refusing to let his heart cling to anything, except for the one person he couldn't let go. He glanced at the phone screen, where a message from the driver appeared, reporting that he was waiting to pick up his younger sister from her drawing class, and for one very brief instant, the steel in his eyes softened, just before the first rain began to tap against the window panes of the abandoned building in the old harbor district. That rare, tender moment didn't last long, because only a few minutes later, the phone in Lucian's hand vibrated again. This time it was a call, not a message, and the name appearing on the screen made him frown slightly. He answered, and on the other end came the driver's voice, broken, frantic, stammering so badly it almost failed to form complete sentences. The man said the girl was no longer where he had left her, that he had only stepped away for a short while. But when he came back, the place was empty. Lucian shot to his feet, and for the first time that entire evening, the calm surface of him, frozen like a winter lake, cracked. He lowered his voice, forcing each word to remain steady, and told the man to start from the beginning, slowly and clearly. Between ragged breaths, the driver explained that after the drawing class, on the way home, Sophie had insisted on being allowed to push her wheelchair by herself for a short distance along the street. She had said she wanted to get used to managing on her own, that she didn't want someone beside her all the time like a child who couldn't take care of herself. The man had hesitated, but the sky had still been clear then, and the street was quiet and empty, so he had given in, pulling the car back and parking a little farther away, close enough to keep watch while still giving her a little space. Then the clouds had rolled in faster than anyone could have expected. The rain came crashing down in the blink of an eye, and he hurried to drive back around to pick her up, but at that exact moment, a stalled truck blocked the road. It took him several minutes to maneuver past it, and by the time he reached the spot, Sophie was gone. He had called her number dozens of times, but the phone couldn't be reached. Maybe her battery had died, because that afternoon she had already complained that it was almost out. Lucian fell silent when he heard that, and inside that silence was something his men had never seen in him before. Fear. The man whose name made the entire underworld of the city hold its breath. The man who only moments earlier had coldly decided another man's fate with a mere tilt of his head, now stood in the middle of the dark room with his phone clenched tightly in his hand, and for the first time, he felt helpless. He didn't cut the driver off with the fury the man was trembling in expectation of. He only said, in a hoarse voice, that the man was to stay exactly where he was, and that he would handle everything. Then he ended the call and began to move with the speed and precision of a man accustomed to running an entire hidden network. He made one call after another, ordering his people to spread through every street around the area where she had disappeared. He demanded that they check every street camera, every shop that still had its lights on, every shadowed corner where a wheelchair might have become trapped. In Lucian's world, he had eyes everywhere. Every alley, every intersection, every late-night diner had someone whose face he knew, and all the power he had spent so many years building was now poured into a single purpose: finding his little sister. He grabbed his coat in haste, strode down the stairs, and rushed out to the black car waiting beneath the rain, which was falling harder with every passing minute. When he slid behind the wheel, he caught the faint reflection of himself in the water-streaked glass, and in that moment, he recognized a naked truth. All the power he possessed, all the fear he inspired, the entire empire he had built from blood and calculation, would mean nothing at all if he didn't find her tonight. He started the engine, and the car tore away through the white blur of rain, carrying a brother racing against every passing minute, searching every soaked road in Seattle for the one thing that could still make his hardened heart tremble with fear. While outside, a brother was searching through every street. Inside the warm laundromat, Sophie had nearly finished her mug of milk, and a faint touch of pink was beginning to return to her pale cheeks. Clara pulled her chair a little closer, quietly watching the girl, and she realized that beneath that cautious shell was a sorrow deeper than the cold of the rainy night, a sorrow that didn't belong to someone her age. She didn't press her for answers. She only let one gentle sentence fall between them, saying that sometimes it was easier to talk in a warm room with a stranger than with the people we knew, because strangers didn't judge us. Sophie looked up at her, her eyes shimmering beneath the yellow light, and as though those words had touched a door she had kept locked for a very long time, she began to speak. At first, she hesitated. Then the words simply started spilling out. She told Clara that there had been a time when she, too, had run and played like other children, when she had a home filled with laughter, with a father and a mother, until the fateful night when her whole family was in the same car on the way back from a vacation. She didn't tell the details. She only said that after that night, she woke up in the hospital and learned that her parents were gone, and that her legs would never walk the way they once had. Her voice sank lower, her hands tightening around the edge of the blanket, as she said that from then on, everything in her life had changed, and the hardest part wasn't the wheelchair. It was the feeling that she had become a burden. She said her older brother had carried everything, had taken care of her so completely that she lacked nothing, with caretakers, private doctors, and drivers to take her anywhere she needed to go. But that very care sometimes made her feel as if she couldn't breathe, because she felt more like a precious possession that had to be guarded than a human being allowed to live. "He's so busy," she said softly. "There's always something important, and I know he loves me in his own way, but it's been so long since anyone asked me what I truly wanted. No one asks me how I feel. Everyone just decides for me, and then tells me it's for my own good." She lowered her head and whispered that sometimes she wondered whether the world would feel lighter without someone like her, someone who couldn't even travel a short distance on her own, someone whose existence only made other people worry and suffer. Hearing that, Clara felt as if something had closed around her heart, because she understood better than anyone the feeling of being unnecessary in her own life. She didn't rush to argue with empty comfort. She only knelt beside the wheelchair until her eyes were level with Sophie's, placed her warm hand over the girl's cold ones, and said in a voice that was firm yet tender that Sophie wasn't a burden to anyone, that needing help never made a person unnecessary, because if it did, then no one in this world would deserve to live, since everyone, sooner or later, needed a hand reaching out to them. Sophie looked up, her eyes red with tears, and Clara asked her a question that perhaps no one had asked in a very long time. She asked that if no one arranged anything for her now, if she were allowed to choose anything she wanted, what would she want most in this world? The question left Sophie stunned, her lips trembling, as though even she had never dared to let herself think of the answer. She was silent for a long while. Then tears began rolling down her cheeks, and through her choked sobs, she said that she only wanted to feel, just once more, that she was part of something, that someone looked at her as a person and not as a responsibility, that she could live one day without feeling guilty for existing. Clara said nothing more. She only wrapped her arms around the girl and held her tightly, as though she wanted to pour all her warmth into her, and inside the small laundromat in the middle of a rainy Seattle night, two people carrying different wounds leaned against each other in silence, while outside, the rain kept falling without end. That warm embrace had only just managed to soothe Sophie when outside, through the curtain of rain, the headlights of a black car shone straight into the laundromat window, and only a few seconds later, the door was shoved open with such force that the wind chime hanging from the frame clattered wildly. Lucian Marchetti stepped inside, soaked through, his hair plastered with rain, but there was nothing weakened about him. On the contrary, he carried a kind of pressure that seemed to make the whole room sink lower. His steel-gray eyes swept once across the room and instantly locked onto the sight of Clara kneeling close beside his sister. And in that moment, all the fear that had been compressed inside him for hours suddenly turned into a cold fury. He strode forward, his voice low and sharp, as he asked who this woman was and what she was doing with his sister. Clara startled and shot to her feet. By instinct, she stepped back once, but she still placed herself between the strange man and the girl, because she didn't know whether the person who had just burst in was a friend or an enemy. Lucian didn't give her time to explain. He moved one step closer, lowering his voice into a warning heavy with threat, saying he had spent hours searching the whole city, and if he found out she had meant Sophie any harm, she would regret it for the rest of her life. Those words carried the weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed, a man who only had to lift an eyebrow to make others tremble, and Clara felt the cold run clearly down her spine. But instead of bowing her head and giving in, she raised her face and looked straight into his burning eyes. And in a voice that trembled but didn't retreat, she answered that she didn't know who he was, and she didn't need to know how powerful he might be. All she knew was that a few hours earlier, she had seen a girl in a wheelchair shaking outside in the cold rain, and she had done what any decent human being would do. She had brought her somewhere warm, given her something hot to drink, and stayed with her so she wouldn't have to be afraid alone. Clara went on, her voice breaking with emotion, saying that if he truly cared about this girl, then the first thing he should have said when he walked in was to ask whether she was all right, not to threaten the person who had taken her in. The sentence struck Lucian like an invisible slap. He went still, his anger freezing halfway through its rise, and at that very moment, a small sound rang out, cutting through the tension swelling in the room. It was Sophie's voice. She had rolled her wheelchair closer, and when she looked at her brother standing there drenched because he had searched all over the city for her, then looked over at the kind woman who had just protected her, something broke open inside her small chest, and she began to laugh. It was a clear laugh threaded with tears, and she told him he didn't have to be so fierce, because Clara was a good person, and she had saved her. The moment Sophie laughed, Lucian stood frozen in place, because he couldn't remember the last time he had seen his sister smile like that. A smile that wasn't forced, wasn't politely arranged for others, but truly came from joy inside her heart, the kind of smile he had thought had vanished forever from her face, since the day disaster came crashing down on their family. He stood there, the two hands that had once made the whole underworld tremble now hanging helpless at his sides, his steel-gray eyes wavering for the briefest instant. And in that short moment, the cold armor he had worn around himself for so many years suddenly cracked, revealing a man stunned to realize that what he had been searching for all evening wasn't only a missing girl, but also something he had lost a very long time ago, without ever knowing it. That night, Lucian brought his sister back to the vast mansion on the hill overlooking the bay, and before leaving the laundromat, he stood silently in front of Clara for a moment, meaning to say something, but in the end, all he managed was a brief and somewhat awkward thank you, because that was a language he had gone far too long without knowing how to use. The days that followed passed inside that mansion, and Lucian, who had always been swept into endless phone calls and calculations, suddenly began to notice very small things he had never paid attention to before. He noticed that his sister woke earlier, no longer sitting for hours by the window and staring outside with the same hollow eyes as before. Instead, she would sometimes hum a quiet little melody. She ate more at meals, and now and then, she even started conversations with the house staff about the small, ordinary details of the day. One afternoon, as he was passing by her room, he stopped at the threshold and saw Sophie bent over her desk, the pencil in her hand, gliding across the page of the sketchbook she always held so tightly, the same sketchbook that, in all the 3 years since disaster had fallen on them, he had never once seen her open. He stood there watching in silence, not daring to make even the smallest sound for fear of startling her, and a feeling rose in his chest that was both warm and painfully sharp. Warm, because she had found her way back to something she had once loved. Painful, because he realized that for all that time, he had been so close to her, yet he had never truly seen her. And then he noticed something else. Clara's name kept appearing every now and then in his sister's stories. Sometimes Sophie would tell him how good Clara was at making warm milk. Sometimes she would wonder whether, at that hour, Clara might be working in that small laundromat. Sometimes she would ask him whether she could see Clara again. Each time he heard her mention that woman, Lucian felt something stir inside him that he couldn't quite name, because he understood that the change in his sister hadn't come from some expensive gift he could buy, nor from some gifted doctor he could hire. It had come from one brief, rainy night, beside a stranger who had nothing in her hands except kindness. That left him restless, because all his life he had been used to believing that every problem in this world could be solved with power and money, that as long as he was strong enough and rich enough, he could protect whatever he treasured. And yet that poor woman in the laundromat had done the one thing all his power and wealth had failed to do for 3 long years. She had made his sister smile again and pick up a pencil once more. He began to wonder who that woman truly was, why someone who didn't know them at all would be willing to rush out into the cold rain and take in a strange child without expecting anything in return. And that unconditional kindness, something so rare it almost didn't exist in the calculating underworld where he had lived for so long, made him all the more curious and uneasy. Finally, after many sleepless nights, he decided he needed to understand her better. Not with the suspicion he had carried that first night when he burst into the laundromat, but with a feeling he had never allowed himself to have, a sincere concern. And perhaps that was the first time in many years that Lucian Marchetti's frozen heart stirred softly, wanting to move toward another human being. While, in the mansion on the hill, a man was lying awake with thoughts of her, Clara Bennett's life continued to move forward with the same heavy burden it had always carried, because the kindness she had given away on that rainy night hadn't lightened a single weight from her thin shoulders. Every morning, before the sky had fully brightened, she had to wake in the cramped apartment on the 3rd floor of an old rental building, where the water pipes groaned and rattled every night, and warmth was always a luxury. The first thing she did each day was bend beside the small bed to check the breathing of her son, little Noah, a boy only 4 years old, with wide round eyes and a smile that could make all her exhaustion melt away. Noah had suffered from asthma since he was very young, and whenever the weather turned cold or the dampness rose, Clara lived in constant fear that a spell of breathlessness could come over him at any moment. So she always had to keep medicine and an inhaler ready in the house, even though their cost often swallowed nearly all the small amount of money she had managed to save. That burden alone would have been enough to wear any mother down, but it wasn't the only burden pressing on her. A few years earlier, the husband she had once trusted had quietly walked away in the hardest season of their lives, leaving her not only with a small child, but also with a mountain of debt he had borrowed and then washed his hands of. From that day on, Clara had carried alone a debt she hadn't created, working herself to the bone through one shift after another, hoping to pay it down little by little, though the day it would finally shrink still seemed nowhere in sight. That was why she had to take those long, endless night shifts at the laundromat, trading away her sleep and her health for a little more money to keep things going, leaving Noah with a kind neighbor to watch over him whenever she had to work late. And as if all of that still weren't enough, there was a third shadow always prowling around her already unsteady life. The landlord named Garrett Cole, a man who not only owned the building, but also held in his hands the debt she was paying off in installments. Garrett wasn't a decent man. He was used to using the advantage of money to press down on poor tenants, and with Clara, a single mother with no one powerful behind her, he pushed even harder. He often came knocking at her door at the worst possible times, dropping words that were half mocking and half threatening. Sometimes he would remind her smoothly of the money she still owed. Sometimes he would hint that a debt-ridden single mother like her had no proper right to raise a child well. Those poisonous words were like needles pricking again and again at the deepest fear inside her heart. Each time, Clara could only grit her teeth and endure it, trying to keep her voice calm and her back straight, because she understood that she didn't have enough strength to fight a man who held both the roof that sheltered her and her son from rain and sun, and the debt hanging over her head. At night, after she had soothed Noah to sleep and finished everything that needed doing, she often sat quietly beside the old table in the small kitchen, staring at the stack of bills and debt notices piled on top of one another, her heart heavy, wondering how much longer she could keep carrying it all. And yet, every time she turned and looked at her son's peaceful sleeping face, Clara felt a strange strength flare to life inside her, the kind of strength only mothers knew. She told herself that no matter how many more burdens life chose to pile onto her shoulders, she would not collapse, because she still had one reason, too great and too precious, to let herself fall. The day when all the pressure that had been building for so long finally burst open began like any ordinary day. With Clara standing in front of the rental building late one afternoon, a bag of medicine she had just bought for Noah in her hand, when Garrett Cole appeared. This time, he didn't sneak up to knock on her apartment door as he usually did. He swaggered straight into the shared courtyard, where quite a few other tenants were coming and going. He deliberately raised his voice so everyone around them could hear, hurling insults about her debt, calling her a freeloader who was running from responsibility, then laughing coldly as he said that if she didn't come up with enough money by the end of the week, he would throw her and her son out, no matter how bitter the winter was or how sick her child might be. The neighbors standing nearby all lowered their faces in silence. Not one of them dared to speak, because everyone was afraid that if they displeased him, they would be his next victims, and that silence only made Garrett push harder. He pointed straight at Clara's face and sneered that a woman who couldn't even keep her husband, who was so buried in debt she couldn't pay what she owed, had no right to dream of raising a child into a decent person. Those words struck the deepest pain in Clara's heart like a knife. And this time, something inside her suddenly broke open. She no longer bowed her head and endured it as she had before. She set the bag of medicine down hard on the step, snapped her head up, walked straight toward him, and though her whole body was trembling with anger, her voice rang out clearly across the crowded courtyard. She said she wasn't running from anything, that she had worked herself to exhaustion through shift after shift to slowly repay a debt she hadn't even created, and that she might be poor, she might be in debt, but she had never lost her self-respect the way he had by trampling other people just to satisfy his own arrogance. She went on, her eyes not avoiding his for even a second, saying that he could take away her home, he could squeeze her for every last penny she had, but there was one thing he would never have the right to touch, and that was the dignity of a mother fighting with everything in her to protect her child. Her son, even if he had to grow up with too little, would still be taught to become a decent human being, something Garrett would likely never understand in his entire life. Her words sent a small stir through the crowd around them. A few people began lifting their heads to look, and Garrett's face flushed for a moment, because a woman he had always looked down on had dared to stand up and answer him in front of so many people. But Clara's courage, no matter how powerful, was still the courage of someone who had nothing in her hands except righteousness, and Garrett, who was used to using money and authority to crush others, quickly recovered his arrogance. He stepped close, lowering his voice into a threat, saying she would regret daring to open her mouth, that he had more than enough power to turn her already miserable life into something even closer to hell. At that exact tense moment, while Clara was still standing straight in front of him, though she had begun to feel, deep inside, the helplessness of someone with no one to stand for her. A gleaming black car slowly glided up and stopped right outside the gate of the rental building. The car door opened, and a tall figure stepped out into the fading afternoon light. Lucian Marchetti appeared, his stride unhurried, yet carrying a quiet authority that made the entire courtyard fall suddenly silent. His steel-gray eyes swept over the scene before him, paused on Clara's face, still marked by outrage, then shifted to the arrogant man in front of her, and in a single instant, he understood exactly what was happening. A very faint smile flickered at the corner of his mouth, the kind of smile that warned that the man who had been so aggressive only moments earlier was about to learn what it meant to run into the one person he should never have touched. Lucian walked into the middle of the courtyard with unhurried steps. Behind him, two broad-shouldered men in dark suits silently stopped at the gate, and that presence alone was enough to change the air around them, because everyone could feel at once that the man who had just arrived was no ordinary person. At first, Garrett still held on to his arrogant expression. He turned toward the stranger and snapped rudely, asking who Lucian thought he was to interfere in his business. But Lucian didn't rush to answer. He only let his eyes move slowly over the man from head to toe with the calmness of someone observing something not worth his concern. Then he quietly spoke his name, only the single word Marchetti. The moment that family name left his mouth, Garrett's smug face visibly went pale, because in Seattle, even a man like him, who made a habit of bullying the weak, had heard rumors about that family, about the man who held an entire underworld in his hands, the man no one dared to name directly. And now the terrifying figure from those rumors was standing right in front of him. Lucian didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't wave a hand or let a single vulgar word fall from his mouth. His weapons were his cold composure and the things he knew. Slowly, he told Garrett that he already knew every filthy trick the man had used to squeeze poor tenants, from the shady fees he had invented on his own, to the times he had sent people to threaten families who could no longer afford to pay. Everything Garrett had thought he had done in the dark was now resting neatly in Lucian's hands. With every sentence Lucian spoke, Garrett's face changed another shade, from arrogance to confusion, then from confusion to fear, because he understood that before a man like this, the small, pitiful power he had strutted around with for so long was nothing more than a joke. Lucian stepped closer, lowering his voice until it was very quiet, and that softness only made each word more chilling. He said that from this moment on, the entire debt Clara had been carrying would be wiped clean, that Garrett would never be allowed to come near her or her son again, and that if he dared bully anyone in this building one more time, the little empire he was clinging to would turn to smoke after a single phone call from Lucian. Garrett, the man who only minutes earlier had swaggered around, crushing others in front of a crowd, now trembled and stammered. He tried to salvage the last scraps of his dignity, but fear had already broken his voice. In the end, he lowered his head, muttered out apologies, and promised that he would never dare touch Clara or her child again. That hunched, submissive posture stood in complete contrast to the aggression he had shown at the beginning, and the crowd watching the scene could only stand there in stunned silence. After Garrett had scurried away with his back bent under terror, Lucian finally turned to Clara, and the frightening coldness from moments before seemed to vanish, giving way to a far gentler look. He quietly told her that she wouldn't have to worry about that man anymore. Clara stood there with her heart tangled between gratitude and a confusion she couldn't explain, because she had never seen anyone make a brutal man like Garrett bow his head with only a few words. As for Lucian, when he returned to his black car, even he realized something that sent a faint unease through his chest. Throughout all the years he had spent building his underworld empire, he had always kept one rule. He never stepped openly into the light for an outsider, never revealed that someone existed who could make him act in person. And yet today, for a woman he had only met a couple of times, he had broken the rule he had guarded for so long. In the world full of watching eyes where he lived, he understood that an act like that was no different from showing his enemies where his weakness lay, though at that moment, he still couldn't imagine just how great the price of that exposure would one day become. After the day Garrett was forced to submit, the connection between the two families who had once been strangers gradually grew closer, and because Sophie kept talking about Clara and her little son, Lucian finally arranged for Clara and Noah to visit the mansion on the hill on a sunny weekend afternoon. When Noah first stepped into that vast house, the 4-year-old boy's eyes widened as he looked around with delight. But what made him cry out with the most joy wasn't the expensive things. It was the moment he saw Sophie sitting beside a large table with all kinds of colored pencils spread everywhere. Sophie waved him closer, and before long, the two children had their heads bent together over a sheet of paper. Noah busily colored messy streaks with his clumsy little hands, while Sophie patiently held his hand and guided each line, now and then bursting into laughter when the boy smeared blue outside the frame. While they drew, Sophie also told Noah stories she had made up herself. Stories about a little rabbit who got lost and was taken in by a kind family of forest animals. Stories about a small house where everyone loved one another. And Noah listened with rapt attention, every so often looking up to ask innocent questions that made Sophie laugh out loud. From the far end of the room, Lucian stood silently by the doorway, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold without him noticing, and he kept watching the scene before him, unable to bring himself to move away, because it had been far too long since that cold mansion had last echoed with the bright, clear sound of children's laughter like that. He watched his sister laugh and play so naturally beside the boy. He watched how the two children paid no mind to the wheelchair or to any difference at all. They were simply two small souls happy in each other's company, and inside him rose a strange warmth he couldn't quite name. Then, at that very moment, one innocent sentence from Noah made his heart sink. The little boy lifted the picture he had just finished coloring, a picture in which he had drawn people holding hands beside a house with a chimney, and he innocently asked Sophie whether the tall man standing over there in the corner was her father, because he looked a little sad. Then he added that his own home didn't have a father, so he wished he had someone standing beside him in a picture like that too. That innocent remark from a 4-year-old child pierced straight into the deepest hidden place inside Lucian like an invisible arrow, because it touched the very emptiness he had tried to bury for so many years, the quiet longing for a real home that he had thought he had lost the right to dream about, from the day disaster took his parents and left him with the burden of forcing himself to become his sister's support. He stood there, his hand tightening slightly around the edge of the doorway, his steel-gray eyes, usually so cold, suddenly stinging, and for the first time, he realized that this simple happiness unfolding right before him, this sight of people who shared no blood yet gathered around one another with sincere love, was the very thing all his wealth and power had never been able to buy. Sophie looked up and caught her brother's eyes in the doorway. She smiled, then waved for him to come over and draw with her and Noah, and Lucian, the man the entire underworld of the city feared, after a brief moment of hesitation, set down his cup of tea and slowly walked toward that colorful table, letting the ice wrapped around his heart crack one more time, quietly yet deeply, before the warm sight of two children and an unfinished drawing of a family. The warm joy of that afternoon didn't last long before a sudden crisis came in the middle of the night, when Clara, sunk in a restless sleep after an exhausting shift, jolted awake to the labored sound of her son's breathing coming from the small bed beside her. She sprang up, hurriedly lifted Noah into her arms, and with one look at his flushed face and the way his little shoulders strained for air, she understood that this asthma attack was worse than any he had ever had before. In panic, she searched for the familiar inhaler and gave it to him exactly as the doctor had instructed. But this time, it didn't seem to be enough to ease his breathing, and the terror of a mother began rising thick and suffocating inside her chest. Clara knew her son needed to be taken to the hospital at once, that he needed specialized care. No temporary remedy at home could replace, but in that same moment, another fear cut into her heart, because she knew very well that his condition required a good medical facility, with doctors skilled in pediatric respiratory care, and the cost of such places was far beyond her reach, while the meager insurance she had was tangled in all kinds of complicated procedures that could force her child to wait for hours in the middle of an emergency. Her hands trembled as she held him against her, her mind spinning between fear for her son's life and the helplessness of a poor mother who didn't have enough money. And in that moment of desperation, she suddenly remembered the business card Lucian had given her the day before, along with his instruction that if anything happened, she should call him, no matter the hour. Clara wasn't someone used to asking anyone for help, but her love for her child overcame every hesitation. With trembling fingers, she dialed the number, and after only 2 rings, Lucian's voice sounded on the other end, alert and composed, even though it was long past midnight. As soon as he heard Clara choking through the situation with Noah, he didn't ask a single unnecessary question. He only told her to stay calm, hold her son close, and get ready, because he was coming right away. Less than 15 minutes later, the familiar black car stopped in front of the rental building, and Lucian personally ran upstairs, carefully helped mother and child down to the car, then immediately called a leading pediatric pulmonologist he knew and asked the doctor to be at the hospital that very night. All the way to the hospital, he drove fast but steadily, while reassuring Clara in a firm voice that everything would be all right, that he had already taken care of everything, and that all she needed to do was stay beside her son and not be afraid. When they arrived, thanks to the arrangements he had made ahead of time, Noah was taken into the emergency room immediately, without having to wait or get caught in any paperwork, because Lucian had guaranteed the entire hospital bill and handled all necessary documents lawfully, using his own money and legitimate connections to open the fastest path for the little boy to receive the best care. The skilled doctor and the devoted team of nurses quickly brought the situation under control, and after a stretch of time that felt endless to Clara as she paced helplessly outside, the emergency room door finally opened with the good news that Noah was out of danger and was gradually breathing evenly again. Clara rushed to her son's bedside, took his small hand, now slowly warming again, and tears poured down her face in sheer relief. And when she looked up, she saw Lucian standing silently in the corner of the room, his eyes fixed on the little boy with a tenderness she had never expected from a man so powerful. In that moment, her heart filled with a deep gratitude no words could express, because she understood that without him tonight, she wouldn't have known how to save the small child who was her whole world. During the days Noah remained in the hospital for monitoring and recovery, Clara had more time to observe the man who had stepped in to help her and her son, and the more she watched, the more she realized that Lucian Marchetti wasn't an ordinary man. Despite the polished courtesy his outward manner showed, the first thing that drew her attention was the way everyone in the hospital treated him, from the doctors who were used to being respected, to the leadership of an entire major medical facility. All of them showed an unusual kind of deference whenever he appeared. They spoke softly, their manner somewhat cautious, as though they were standing before someone they didn't dare offend. She noticed that with only one brief phone call, things that ordinary people would have to wait weeks for, tangled in piles of paperwork and procedure, were settled in a matter of moments. The best private room was arranged, the most expensive medicines were brought in, and every obstacle seemed to disappear automatically before him, as if no barrier could exist for a man like that. Then she began to notice the quiet men who always seemed to appear somewhere around him. Large men with watchful eyes that kept scanning their surroundings, standing at just the right distance from him. She understood they weren't ordinary friends or colleagues, but protectors, the kind of men who only surrounded figures of enormous power or people who carried matters of great consequence. Once, while she was sitting in the hallway, she accidentally overheard two hospital employees whispering to each other. They mentioned the Marchetti name in a voice that carried both respect and fear. One of them said it was best never to get involved in anything connected to that family. The other nodded in agreement, then quickly changed the subject when someone passed by, and that brief scrap of conversation kept haunting Clara's mind long after. She began to piece together all the fragments she had witnessed, from the way Lucian had made an arrogant man like Garrett bow his head in terror with only a few words, to the quiet and frightening authority radiating from him, to the almost limitless wealth and vast network of connections that seemed able to reach everywhere. Slowly, a vague but terrifying truth took shape in her mind, that this man must be involved in some world outside the law, a world of hidden calculations and forces that ordinary people like her only heard about in frightening stories. That realization left Clara's heart in turmoil, because on one hand, she couldn't deny that this very man had done everything he could to help her and her son. He had lifted the debt crushing her shoulders, and he had won her son back from danger on a critical night, all with a sincere kindness she could clearly feel. But on the other hand, the fear of a mother rose fiercely inside her, because she understood that the world he lived in was full of danger, a place where grudges and hatred could fall without warning on anyone who came too close. And what she feared most in this world was Noah's safety, the tiny child who had just escaped the edge of death, the child she had sworn to protect with her own life. She stood silently beside the window of the hospital room, looking at her son sleeping peacefully, then looking toward Lucian's tall figure at the end of the hallway, and a painful question rose inside her. Should she allow herself and her son to continue stepping deeper into the life of a man who carried so many mysteries and so much danger within him? A question she knew, sooner or later, she would have to answer. Perhaps Lucian had sensed the caution growing in Clara's eyes each time she looked at him, because one evening, after Noah had fallen deeply asleep in his hospital room, he asked her to step out into the quiet hallway and talk for a moment. And there, beside the window overlooking the city as its lights came on, He did something he perhaps had never done with anyone before. He opened his heart and told her about his past. He told her that he understood what she had seen, and that there must be many questions in her heart. He said he didn't want her to be afraid or misunderstand who he was, so he wanted to speak the truth himself, instead of leaving her to guess. He told her he hadn't been born to become the man he was now, that there had once been a time when he, too, had been an ordinary young man with simple dreams, until disaster came without warning and took everything from him in a single night, leaving him, still far too young, to shoulder the responsibility of a little sister who had lost both her legs and the people she depended on. He said that in those darkest days, when he had no one left to lean on, and had to face both the debts and the men waiting to devour 2 orphaned siblings, he had been forced to step into that dangerous underworld, not because he craved power or money, but for one reason only: to become strong enough to protect his sister, so no one could ever hurt Sophie again. He admitted that the road he had walked wasn't clean, that he had done things he wasn't proud of, but he had always tried to hold on to one boundary he would never cross, never harming the innocent, and never touching the weak, because he understood better than anyone what it felt like to have the whole world turn its back when you no longer had any way to defend yourself. Clara listened in stunned silence, and while she was trying to arrange all the tangled emotions inside her heart, Sophie, who had been sitting quietly there all along, gently rolled her wheelchair closer to Clara, holding the sketchbook she always kept so tightly with her. She looked up at Clara with shining eyes, then softly turned the pages for her to see, and Clara realized that the first pages of the sketchbook were filled only with dark and lonely drawings. A little girl sitting alone in an empty room. A small figure lost in a vast open space. Every line soaked with the sadness of a soul that had once believed she was nothing more than an unnecessary burden in this world. But the farther Sophie turned toward the final pages, the more the drawings changed. The colors slowly grew brighter, and then Sophie stopped at the newest page, the one she had just finished. When Clara looked at it, she felt her heart catch in her throat. On that sheet of paper, Sophie had drawn a picture of a family. There was a tall older brother smiling gently, no longer wearing that cold expression. There was Sophie herself sitting in her wheelchair, but her face was radiant with happiness. There was a gentle woman whom she had drawn to look exactly like Clara, and beside her was a small boy holding everyone's hand. All of them stood together in front of a warm house beneath a sky full of sunlight, and at the top of the page, in the careful handwriting of a little girl, she had written the word family. Sophie looked up at Clara, her voice trembling yet filled with hope, and whispered that this was what she had always dreamed of, that since the rainy night when she met Clara, it was the first time in so many years that she had dared to draw a family again, because she felt that perhaps a home like that was no longer something too far away for her. Hearing those words and looking at that drawing filled with love, Clara could no longer hold herself together. Tears rolled down her face, and she opened her arms and pulled the girl into a tight embrace, while Lucian stood there silently watching the 2 people his heart treasured most, his steel-gray eyes blurring before he even realized it. A few days later, after Noah had been discharged from the hospital and his health was gradually recovering, Clara's life settled for a while into a rare stretch of quiet, and she used those calm days to think carefully about everything that had happened. One afternoon, she sat alone beside the window of her small apartment, watching the late-day sunlight spread gold across the rooftops, quietly taking a sip of warm tea, while Noah was absorbed in coloring the picture he had brought home from the mansion the other day. The soft laughter of a child, the faint fragrance of tea, and the gentle stillness of that afternoon eased her heart for a little while, but hidden beneath that surface peace was a struggle that still had no end. On one side was the reason of a mother who always placed her child's safety above everything else, the part of her that kept whispering a warning that she should stay away from that man, that the world Lucian lived in was far too dangerous, that even being connected to him could place her small son in harm's way, and that the wisest and safest choice was to quietly withdraw from his life before things went too far. But on the other side was her heart, where she kept everything she had seen with her own eyes. A man with a fearsome name, yet one who had been willing to rush through the night to save her son. A man who had silently lifted some of the hardships from her and Noah without demanding anything in return. A man who, behind that cold and icy shell, carried a heart that had been deeply wounded but still hadn't lost its boundary of decency. She thought of Sophie, of the girl who had once believed she was an unnecessary burden and now knew how to smile and dream of a home. She thought of the tenderness in Lucian's eyes as he looked at Noah sleeping, and she thought of the drawing Sophie had made, the one with the word family written on it, an image that kept returning again and again to her mind and warming her heart each time she remembered it. Clara understood that if she chose to run away, she might keep for herself the safe and familiar life she had known before, but she would also turn her back forever on the people who had sincerely loved her and her son. She would extinguish the hope that had only just begun to glow in the heart of a poor young girl, and more importantly, she would have to live the rest of her life with the aching question of whether she had missed something precious when she chose safety instead of courage. After many sleepless nights, she finally realized that fear, no matter how justified, shouldn't be allowed to control her entire life, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was choose to believe in something good, even when there were countless reasons all around to doubt it. She remembered that rainy night, when she hadn't hesitated to rush out and help a strange girl, simply because it was the right thing to do, and she told herself that if she had dared to trust kindness then, she should dare to trust it one more time now. And so Clara made her own decision, a decision not arranged or persuaded by anyone else, but born from the choice of her own heart. She would stay. She wouldn't run. She would face whatever came next with those people, because she believed that a true family wasn't a place where danger never existed, but a place where people chose to remain beside one another and overcome that danger together. And for the first time in a very long while, once she had become certain of her choice, Clara felt strangely light and peaceful inside. But the peace Clara had just found turned out to be far more fragile than she had imagined. Because in the underworld full of watching eyes where Lucian lived, no action could take place without someone noticing, and the fact that he had openly stepped forward in person for a poor woman and her small son had not escaped the gaze of those who had always been waiting for a crack in his armor. For so many years, Lucian Marchetti had been known as an unbreakable fortress, a man with no family, no lover, no emotional attachment that anyone else could use against him, and that cold loneliness had become his strongest shield, because no one could threaten a man who had nothing to lose. But now, through the way he had brought Garrett down in the middle of a crowd just to protect Clara, through the way he had personally rushed to the hospital in the night to save her son, his hidden enemies had recognized the one thing they had been waiting for a very long time. At last, the man who had seemed to have no weakness had found a soft place in his heart. He had people he was willing to break every rule to protect. Among those enemies was an old force that had carried a grudge against Lucian for years, someone who had tried many times to bring him down and had never succeeded, because he could never find an opening in that cold and careful man. And now, when Lucian's weakness had finally been revealed, that enemy understood that the opportunity he had been waiting for had arrived. Instead of aiming straight at Lucian as before, attempts that had always failed, this time the enemy chose a far more vicious move, targeting the very people Lucian treasured, because they understood all too well that striking a man's heart was always more likely to make him collapse than striking at his strength. Strange signs began to appear. Several of Lucian's business locations were harassed. Unspoken warnings were sent. Then he received a chilling message, hinting that his enemy knew clearly about the woman at the laundromat and her small son, and that they also knew about the sister he loved more than anything. It was a message that didn't need to say everything directly, but it was enough for him to understand that the people he most wanted to protect had now been placed in their sights. When he read those threatening words, a cold fear he hadn't felt in a very long time suddenly tightened around Lucian's heart, because he understood better than anyone how merciless the world he lived in could be. And with bitterness, he realized that the warmth he had only just found again, that very moment when he had dared to open his heart to love after so many hardened years, had become the rope his enemies could seize to choke him. This was exactly the thing he had long warned himself to guard against, the cruel rule of the underworld he knew by heart, that revealing a weakness meant handing the enemy the very weapon that could destroy him. Yet now, when his heart had already become attached to those people, he finally understood the full price of love in a life like his. Lucian stood motionless in his office, both hands braced on the desk, his head bowed beneath the weight of a brutal truth. He was now facing a choice he could no longer avoid. Either he would continue down the path of power he had walked for so many years, and accept that the people he loved would live forever inside a circle of danger, or he would have to find some way to protect them completely, no matter how high a price it demanded of him. And he knew that the time he had left to make that decision was running out with every anxious beat of his heart. Lucian knew he no longer had much time to hesitate. So the first thing he did was make absolutely certain of the safety of the people he loved before he began dealing with the threat. He immediately had Sophie taken to a hidden refuge, carefully guarded by his most loyal men, while also arranging for Clara and little Noah to be protected at another safe location, a place where the boy could still play innocently, knowing nothing at all about the storm gathering outside. Once he was sure that none of them could be harmed, Lucian turned to face his enemy, and he understood that if he wanted to end this threat once and for all, he couldn't simply answer it with violence in the way the underworld had always operated. If he continued down that road, there would never be an end. One enemy would fall, and another would rise in his place, and the people Lucian loved would have to live forever, inside a state of fear. He made a decision that only a few months earlier he never would have dared to imagine. He would leave behind completely the world of power he had spent so many years building, but to do that fully, he would have to pay an unimaginably high price. Quietly, Lucian contacted the forces capable of restraining his enemy. He agreed to hand over most of his territory, his business locations, and the hidden sources of profit he had once controlled, using that vast fortune itself as the bargaining piece in one final negotiation, in exchange for permanent safety for the people he held dear. The final confrontation unfolded with breathless tension inside an abandoned warehouse near the harbor, where Lucian walked in alone to face the enemy who had haunted his life for so long. With his calm composure and sharp intelligence, he placed on the table an agreement the other side couldn't refuse. He would surrender everything that had made him feared and powerful, in exchange for a promise that his enemy would leave him and the people he loved alone, and would never be allowed to touch them again. There were moments when the situation became extremely dangerous, when the enemy's greed hovered on the edge of betrayal, but Lucian had anticipated everything. He had prepared the cards he needed to protect himself and force the other side to keep its word, and after a battle of nerves, the enemy finally had no choice but to accept the agreement, because to them, taking over everything Lucian had built was too great a prize to refuse. When he walked out of that warehouse beneath the first light of dawn rising along the horizon, Lucian Marchetti was no longer the powerful boss who made the entire underworld of the city tremble. He had given all of that up with his own hands. Now he was only an ordinary man, empty-handed. And yet, strangely, he had never felt so light or so free. And he knew clearly what had given him enough courage to let go of an entire empire. It was the faith Clara had placed in him, when she chose to stay beside him instead of running away, when she looked at him not as someone frightening but as a human being worthy of love. She had shown him that there was another life worth living, far more than the cold world where he had kept himself imprisoned for so long. He returned to the place where the people he loved were waiting, and when the door opened, Sophie rolled her wheelchair toward him and threw herself into her brother's arms through tears, while Clara stood there with eyes filled with both worry and joy. And Lucian, the man who had just traded everything to win his freedom, smiled at them with a peace he had never known before, because he knew that even though he no longer held power or wealth in his hands, he was still holding the most precious treasure he had searched for all his life, a family. 2 years had passed since that fateful night in the abandoned warehouse, and the lives of the people in this story had turned onto an entirely new page, brighter than anything they had ever dared to dream. Lucian Marchetti, the man who had once made the entire underworld tremble in fear, had truly become a different person. He used the legal portion of his remaining fortune, along with his experience and his iron will, to build something completely new, a charity foundation with a simple yet deeply meaningful name, an organization devoted to helping single mothers struggling to survive and people with disabilities who had been given too little mercy by life. He understood better than anyone what it felt like to brace oneself against the world when no hand reached out to help, and he had also seen with his own eyes how one small act of kindness on a rainy night could change the course of a human life. So he wanted to spread that kindness throughout the city, so that no one would have to wait alone in the cold without a single hand reaching toward them. His foundation helped hundreds of single mothers find stable work, helped poor children receive medical care, and opened classes and support programs created especially for people with disabilities so they could step into life with confidence. And standing beside him through all of that work was Clara, the woman who had become not only the life partner he cherished, but also his devoted companion, because she was the one who had planted the first seed of compassion in his heart. Sophie was now a radiant young woman full of life. She followed her passion for painting, and the pictures she created were no longer the lonely, sorrowful images of the past, but were filled with the colors of hope and love. She also became an inspiration to so many other young people with disabilities through the sharing sessions held at her family's foundation. As for little Noah, the boy from those earlier days had grown bigger, healthy, and bright, raised in the full embrace of a real family, with a mother, with the man he affectionately called father, and with an older sister who always drew beautiful pictures of life with him. One evening, as a light rain once again drifted softly through the streets of Seattle, Clara and Lucian returned together to the small laundromat from years before, the place where everything had begun, and they stood there hand in hand, looking through the glass window speckled with rain, letting the memory of that fateful night return to their hearts. This rain was no longer cold and fierce like the rain from that night long ago. It was gentle and warm, just as their lives had changed, and in that moment, both of them quietly understood that sometimes the greatest miracles in life begin with the smallest and most ordinary acts of kindness, with a hand willing to reach out, with a cup of warm milk given to a stranger, with a heart brave enough to open itself to love even when the world gives it countless reasons to close. Clara and Lucian's story reminds us that true power doesn't lie in the ability to make others afraid, but in the tenderness and courage to truly see and cherish another human being. It reminds us that none of us is an unnecessary burden, and that every person, no matter how poor or small they may seem, carries within them the power to change another life with just a little sincere love. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with the people you love, so together we can spread what is good and listen to many more meaningful stories every day. How do you feel about Clara and Lucian's story? What part of their journey moved you the most? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from the deepest place in your heart, because we're always hoping to hear your voice. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very last moment. May you and your loved ones always be blessed with abundant health, and may you live each day with joy, peace, and serenity. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.